Hello again, this is Roger Capello, bringing you my week at the club. Week number 8 from the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. And this week I have something a little different. You might recall last week that I lost a tough game to Dave Thomas, and Dave went on to play on board 1 this week to play for the winner's spot in this month's tournament against Eric Strickland. And it turned out I played on board 4 against Ed Harris, and we had an okay game, but it ended up being a bit of a lifeless draw where we traded off some pieces and had a symmetric pawn structure, and decided, gee, that really isn't too exciting to show to anybody. And Eric Strickland offered his game that he played with Dave, along with some copious notes that he gave to me, and I don't have nearly enough time to go into the kind of analysis that he put into the game. But I'll give a kind of a cliff summary of the game, or Roger's instead of Cliff's notes, Roger's notes, something like that, to give you a quick idea of how the things went on board 1, because it turned out to be a more interesting game than the one that I played. So I'll get right into it here. I'm trying out a somewhat different interface this time. We'll see how this works from leechess.org. So, okay. There we go. It wasn't allowing me to make moves there for a minute, so I had to play games with it. Okay, so Dave opened up with d4, and Eric replied d5. I'll go through the opening stage fairly quickly here. It developed along the lines of a collie, named after Edgar Collie, a Belgian player. And it's not a terribly ambitious opening for either side, but especially for white. But he does get solid positions out of this. So Eric went ahead and played what is considered a good line against the collie. And Dave decided to go ahead and fianchetto his queen bishop, his dark squared bishop in this case, which is something that's seen on occasion in the collie, although is not the most common move in this position. Castles would be probably a more normal move at this point. Eric traded off the c-pawns and attacked with his knight. Now, this is one of the downsides of white having taken time out to start the fianchetto over here. He's going to put his bishop on b2, or obviously wants to. But the problem, of course, is that it takes time, and now black has a small attack brewing already. He's attacking this bishop on d3. And the best thing here for white to do, actually, is to go ahead and just continue on with his development, and to let black just go ahead and trade the knight for the bishop. So white's lost the bishop pair here, but he's going to have a fairly easy development, and yeah, it's a chess game. It's a pretty even position. Instead of that, what Dave chose to do was to retreat the bishop to e2, and that's a kind of a further loss of time, and in particular it allows an attack along the c file. So Eric replied queen c7, which is the best move. And now he's threatening an immediate knight into c2 check, forking the king and the rook, winning this rook in the corner. And so white's move is pretty much forced in this case. He plays knight to a3, guarding this c2 square again. Now, at this point, there's an interesting move for black, which Eric thought about for a while and rejected. But the computer actually likes it, which is to invade with the queen to c3 check. And this leads to a fair amount of complication. Okay, obviously the king and the rook are being forked. This rook and center. White's reply is pretty much forced to interpose the bishop, and so that the queen then defends the rook. But black can continue queen to b2, attacking this knight on a3, which is not defended. And there are a variety of moves here, but sort of the best line for white is to go ahead and check, and black interposes, and the bishop gets traded off, and then he comes out with a knight, threatening a fork himself on c7. But black gets there first. And basically this position ends up being good for black after the check is given. And now the rook is under attack, but of course he has his own problem here on c7 that he has to worry about, so he can take time out to defend that, or he can go ahead and take the rook. Strongest at this point, I believe, is to go ahead and take the rook. Maybe not strongest, but quite good. And if white takes the time here to check, and the king comes over, and now taking the rook in the corner, the black knight gets out, but the white knight doesn't, is the basic problem. So that line was not gone into. Eric looked at it and decided that it was a little messy. He didn't want to go in for all those complications. So instead, okay, sorry, a little trouble with the interface here. Instead, Eric played bishop to d7, and white simply castled in that position, okay, which is reasonable. The next several moves are somewhat uneventful. Both sides are just continuing on with their development, but black definitely has some pressure along the c-file. White tries to cancel that by opposing the queen with the rook on his own, and black drops back. Another possibility would have been to bring the queen out to a5, maybe a little more active than putting it tucked away on b8. On b8, as we'll see, it's sort of hard for it to get back into the action. Now, at this point, I didn't take that move back. I went forward, so it's actually the move that they've made. So now I will go back a move here. So in this position, the a pawn is under attack. Dave wanted to do something about that and chose the sort of straightforward, undeveloping move to go and defend it. But this leads to him having a fairly permanent disadvantage along the c-file. And much better would have been, at this point, for him just to go ahead and trade the rooks off with check. And then, now that the rook has vacated the back rank, the queen can come over to a1 and defend this pawn on a2. And this is a better formation. Now this rook that's on f1 will come over to c1, and it'll be an even game. So there would have been much more to White's advantage to follow that sequence, but he didn't. So instead he played his rook to a1. After that, black was able to continue on developing. Fairly straightforward developing moves here by both sides. Okay, black is threatening to double here on the c-file. And white decides to get rid of the invading knight here, either force it to retreat or to trade off. And Eric correctly allows it to be traded off. He doesn't initiate the trade. Often with trades, if you allow the other person to actually perform the trade, it will drag your pieces forward instead of you bringing their pieces forward. So, for example, after the knight takes and the bishop takes back, now this dark squared bishop has become an aggressively posted piece, which is better than if he had taken the knight and the white squared bishop had taken back on d3. Okay, so white makes a reasonable move here to control this invading square, so that basically overprotecting the invading square. It's protected by the knight now, but that knight could get exchanged off at a moment's notice, and he doesn't want the rooks to enter on the second rank. So the extra defense of c2 is warranted here. And now black is wants to maneuver to get the queen back in the game. As I said before, the queen was a little bit out of play there on b8, and now he takes a couple moves to bring it into a more active position. So white goes ahead and tries to do something about this knight that was stuck on the side of the board, and at the same time threatening to trade off this intruding bishop, actually threatening to win it if black didn't defend it. So at that point, I'll go back a move here. At this point, if I were playing, the first move that came to my mind was to retreat the bishop and still controls squares, these dark squares on the queen side, and doesn't allow itself to get traded off. That's not what Eric did. And instead, Eric went ahead and played the bishop into c3, which, after I saw him make the move, the point of it became clear that this then allows, if it does get traded off, this allows the rook to further penetrate the position. And that's what happens. And now the pressure along the c-file is starting to look pretty strong with these two major pieces coming down and attacking the knight. And white goes ahead and defends the knight again with the rook. That's a bit of a mistake. As you can see over here on the right-hand side, this is a bar that shows the computer's assessment of the position. And right now it's about 1.5 pawns or 1 3/4 pawns or so in black's favor after this move. Before it, it was only about 1/2 pawn in black's favor. So the computer doesn't like this move. And the reason is because this pin along the c-file is getting to be quite worrisome. If this knight moves away, black could simply play rook takes rook, and white could, the queen is too valuable, of course, couldn't take recapture with the queen, even though there's two defenders on this square. The strong defender is the one that's coming first. So it's not a good situation here, and black continues to maneuver to increase the pressure along that file. So at this point, f3 is probably not a good move, or I'm sorry, let's see. f3 is what white played. It's probably not the best move. It does allow the rook to come up and laterally defend here, come to e2, and then to f2 rather, and then to defend the knights from the side. But there are some other possibilities, and probably getting the queen off of the back rank would be a good idea at this point. So something like queen d2, and then now this knight could be free to move if there weren't more pressure put along the file, which there probably will be with this queen maybe moving to c7. So it's difficult to unwind. So I can't blame Dave in trying to defend the knight along the second rank. Seems as good a try as any, I suppose. So instead of, let's see, after rook over, queen up, instead of moving the queen off the back rank, he pushed the pawn to f3, and Eric brought the bishop in to actually put more pressure on the knight by attacking the defender of the knight, and white responded by trading off. And now here's an interesting point where Eric made the very natural looking queen recapture of queen takes bishop. And that's not the best move. It turns out that the best move here is to recapture with the pawn. And even though this gives you a static weakness, a structural weakness as blacks with these two isolated doubled pawns that would be quite weak, especially in a late middle game or in an end game. In this particular position, it actually helps black to capture this, to recapture this way. And the reason is because it opens up this A file for an attack from the side here, an invasion into white's position. So, for example, in this position, after A takes B5, you might see the rook defending the knight, and now black would triple up, which would keep the queen having to stay defending the knight. limits white's resources. White would make some moves, such as maybe seeking to get counterplay on the king side. And now black, now that he has two pieces attacking along the c-file, that keeps the pin active along of the rook on c1. That the knight still can't move. And so this rook that was on c8 is free to come over to a8 and attack this pawn. And there's really nothing good to do about it. If the rook comes over, now that undefends this knight that's on c2, and it's basically, it's a there are weaknesses all over his position. The queen can, in this particular variation, the queen can come in with a check and go after some of the weak pawns that are on the king side. But there were other possibilities too that were brought on by this attack along the a-file. So back to the real game. Well, Eric recaptured with the queen, and white went ahead and defended with the knight. They defended with the knight on c2. Okay, so the problem with the defense of the rook along the second rank is that it's just hard to unwind this pin, because this rook is necessary for the defense of the knight, and yet so it has to stay on the file, and yet if the knight ever moves, the rook will be lost. So for example, if the queen were to come up here to in this position, if the queen came up to d2, the pin is still very strong along this file, and there's just no way to move the rook away without losing the knight. And black can bring the knight back into redevelop the knight probably through a route like this over to where it could attack the pin knight, and there's really very little that white could do about it. So that's the sort of problem that this defensive line gives you. And so after queen c6, white is kind of reduced to just biding his time, waiting to see what black is going to do to increase the pressure. And what black did do was to shuffle his pieces a little bit. And now at this point, there looks like there's a triple attack that's going to win the knight, but it really can't, because the queen is the second attacking piece. So what black did instead was to put the queen on a square where it's now threatening this pawn over on a2, and if the knight is to move, this rook on c1 is not protected, so that there's still this strong pin going along the c-file, and so the knight really can't move. And how else are you going to defend this knight, this pawn? You could push it, but then then the b pawn becomes mortally weak. So there's really nothing to be done here to defend this pawn. And what Dave did do was to play his rook back to directly defend it. There's not much other possibility that you can do. And for the moment, this rook on c3 is pinned because of the attack of the queen through to the other queen. So Eric, in order to get out of that pin, moves his rook up now, planning to redeploy the queen back behind the rooks. The queen moved over to defend that knight a second time, and now Eric attacks it a third time. And it turns out in this position, this is Aliekin's gun. It's a famous arrangement of the heavy pieces where you've tripled your heavy pieces, and with the queen on the tail end like this, it's very strong because you're not limited in the order that you take the pieces that you're attacking with. Named after Aliekin, who had it in a famous game. But it turns out that the computer doesn't like this move, and for good reason, and that's that it would rather bring the knight into the attack over here on the king side. And it's difficult for white to exert control over this g3 square For example, a bad move would be king to h2, and in which case black could check the king and put a triple attack on the knight, threatening to win it outright. White would have to block with a pawn in order to keep from losing that knight. And now you'd think black could just trade it off, but after an exchange on c2, after rook takes knight, rook takes rook, then the queen is attacking this loose knight over here. So the best that black can do actually is just to win the pawn, but that's good enough. After knight takes pawn, pawn takes knight, rook takes knight, and exchange like so. Clearly black is in the driver's seat. And he's only one pawn ahead, but with that rook on the 7th rank and the king in a perilous position like this, he's clearly invading with his heavy pieces. The queen is going to come up quickly and join the fray. So that's the sort of thing that can happen after knight to h5. But instead, black set up Alyakin's gun, which is that triple attack on the knight. And this is probably the fatal error of the game, where white stepped back into that pin yet one more time, and he never really gets out of the pin after this. So there are 3 attacks now on that rook that's hiding behind the knight, and black has time to, for that maneuver that I spoke about earlier of bringing the knight over to the queen side to attack the pinned knight like that and win it. And there's really not much that white can do about that plan. So he counterattacks in the center. He opens it up. It's not, you know, you've got, when the straightforward moves are bad for you, then you have to figure out something that's will shake the game up and make it go in a different direction. So attacking in the center, I think, makes sense here, but it's just not enough. So Eric trades off the pawns and then attacks that e-pawn. Of course, the threat here is is to take advantage of the fact that this rook is overworked. This rook is defending both the knight and the pawn, and so after knight takes pawn, rook takes back, then this knight on c2 can be taken, and so that wins a pawn. So there are a couple of ways to try to defend this. Dave chose not the right way. The best thing to do in this case is to go ahead and push the d pawn, and there will be some exchanges on d5. But the problem with his move is that he played e5, and that just invites the knight to come in closer to where it wants to be. It's one move away from attacking this knight a second time. And so Dave makes a distraction move, I guess you'd call it, so saying, here, come on over, take my pawn with check. And there's nothing wrong with that, nothing bad. But Eric correctly goes ahead and continues on attacking the pinned knight. And at this point, Dave pushed the d-pawn, again, another distraction move. And the best plan here for black is just to go ahead and to take this pawn. And white really doesn't have that much against black. But Eric was a little afraid that something might happen with the activity on the back rank, so he played a more cautious move maybe to come back and take with the knight, which is okay. He's still clearly winning in this position. White is really reduced to nothing, plus Dave, I think, had very little time at this point. Eric went ahead and took the pawn check. White blocked, and then Eric traded off the rooks, and Dave threw in the towel. And the reason he quit at this point, the reason he resigned, was because of the sequence that's threatened of rook takes knight check. And this is winning material here. After rook takes rook, we simply have queen takes rook, queen takes queen, and the knight comes in to fork, and so black is a whole piece and a couple of pawns, I guess, ahead, and has a trivial job mopping up in this endgame. So it was an interesting effort by Eric, and he went 4-0 this month and won the tournament, Martin Lane Memorial. So congratulations to Eric, and we'll set up the beginning next week of the club championship, which is actually going to be a 5-round Swiss tournament, I understand. It's not a round robin this year, but it's among the top 10 scoring players in the club. So it will be a fun tournament, and I'm, of course, playing in it, and we'll bring you the action round by round, and we'll have to see how that turns out. So until then, this is Roger Capello saying goodbye to you, and enjoy your chess, and I'll see you next week.